The winter storms that have been absolutely rocking Northern California have finally abated for a brief moment, so now it's time to take a look at this, the 2023 Infiniti QX60. Sorry for this being a little bit muddy. The roads are an absolute disaster all around me, so it didn't really seem to make much sense to wash it for the video because it's just going to get incredibly dirty yet again. The QX60 is interesting in the luxury segment because this is the best-selling Infiniti in North America, and that's different than pretty much every other luxury brand out there where the compact crossover is the best seller, and that would be Infiniti's QX50. But I think it's easy to see why. The QX60 is highly competitive because this is the most family-friendly luxury three-row crossover in America. If you have kids in child seats or booster seats, I would say put this on your shopping list ahead of pretty much absolutely everything else. It also is well priced, starting at $49,200. This is the direct competitor to the MDX, the Aviator, the Q7, the X6, the XC90, or you could also see this as a luxury branded alternative to the Nissan Pathfinder, on which it is very closely based, or of course something like a Hyundai Palisade Calligraphy. More on that a little bit later. When it comes to the design, I think Infiniti hit the nail right on the head with the new QX60. It has the right amount of adventurous and the right amount of restraint baked right into the design. Some of the competition, frankly, they look weird up front, and I think the first generation QX60 looked odd from some angles as well because of its very bubbly design language. This has a much more upright hood, much boxier front end, and then they've rounded off the corners a little bit around the headlights, modernized the Infiniti grille by having the headlights cut into it a little bit, but we still have the big and bold Infiniti grille without it looking kind of funky like we find in the spindle grille going on in the Lexus RX. But it's also a little bit more adventurous than the European options, which sometimes can come across as a little bit boring. One weird touch up front though, no fog lights at the bottom of the bumper. When you move around to the side, the boxier profile is instantly recognizable, with the hood being much more horizontal and much more upright than before. In terms of length, this is 198.2 inches long, making this almost exactly the same size as the MDX and the Q7. The Aviator is just a hair longer, and this is right in keeping with some of the longer three-row mainstream vehicles like the Telluride and the Palisade, which you could also be cross-shopping against the QX60. Again, I apologize for this being really dirty in this video, but this week not only have we had tons and tons of rain, we've had a few landslides in properties adjacent to me and on my property as well, and my basement has gone from rising damp to flowing water. So there have been a few other priorities on board in addition to, of course, driving, testing, and filming this vehicle. But all of that definitely impacts my impressions of this, especially the all-wheel drive system and the tires that we have on this model. You can get 18 or 20-inch wheels. They are always going to be wrapped in 255 width tires, which are on the wider side, just as you'd expect in a mainstream vehicle. But Infiniti chose to put hand-cooked tires on the QX60 rather than, more expensive luxury car tires. I was a little surprised by that, and there are compromises. These are relatively quiet, as we'll talk about in the drive section, but handling ability and sort of mud performance, it's not really their forte. If you're cross-shopping a base QX60 with a top-end Nissan Pathfinder, pretty logical because they're about the same price, there's one important thing you should know back here. The hatch is more raked than we find in the Pathfinder, and the roofline is actually a little bit lower in the rear. That gives this a more elegant and sleek profile, but it does reduce cargo practicality and third row headroom a little bit. I find that a tiny bit disappointing because one of the big reasons to get the QX60 has been for its large and accommodating third row, and it actually shrunk a little bit in this generation. The elegant design language continues out back where we find full LED taillight modules, including amber LED turn signals. Those are absolutely my preference. Amber turn signals, some people laugh at this, but they do actually have an impact on safety. According to NHTSA, the National Traffic Highway Administration, amber turn signals reduce certain accident types by up to 10%. So that's why I have a passion for amber turn signals. At any rate, at the bottom of the bumper, we find faux exhaust tips, kind of a page out of Audi's playbook, although they are a little bit less actual exhaust tip-like than we find in modern Audis. The only real exhaust is over there on the passenger side. Infiniti hides the button for the hatch right there just above the N, rather than putting it around the license plate. I like that location because not only is it easier to clean, it's also pretty easy to find. When it comes to active driver assist systems, Infiniti does things a little bit differently than Acura and Lexus. We don't find radar adaptive cruise control standard or blind spot monitoring or lane keeping assistance. But we do have forward collision warning with autonomous emergency braking and pedestrian detection that's pretty standard. What's different is that we have a rear autonomous emergency braking and rear cross-traffic detection standard, things that are normally optional in the competition. Rear autonomous emergency braking is definitely handy if you find yourself in tight parallel parking situations or if you live in a complicated kind of driveway like I do. Blind spot monitoring, 360-degree camera, the heads-up display, adaptive cruise control, lane keeping, driver attention monitoring, and pre-crash tensioners for the seat belts, those are all available, but you won't find them on the base model. This particular QX60 might be a good choice for your next wedding because it is certainly something blue, and under the hood we have something borrowed. This 3.5-liter naturally aspirated V6 engine is the exact same one used in the previous generation QX60. Some folks have complained about that. I don't think it's a problem at all because the power numbers are pretty healthy. 295 horsepower, 270 pound-feet of torque, and I've been running it just fine off of regular unleaded. What was a problem in the previous generation QX60 was the transmission on the other side of the engine bay. It was a continuously variable automatic, and it wasn't a great one. Instead of using that transmission, Nissan gave this a new 9-speed automatic transmission. It's made by ZF of Germany, and it's basically the same 9-speed that's been used in a variety of different Honda and Acura models, also some Chrysler and Jeep models, and a number of vehicles in Europe as well. You get the choice of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. That will determine your fuel economy figures, 23 miles per gallon for front-wheel drive, 22 for all-wheel drive. Now, if you choose the all-wheel drive model, which is the one that I have today, you should know that this all-wheel drive system is not as aggressive as far as sending power to the rear as much of the competition, most notably the Acura MDX. It also is not as aggressive at moving power to the rear, it seems, as a Nissan Pathfinder, especially something like the Rock Creek Pathfinder. In the normal drive modes, it is almost exclusively a front-wheel drive vehicle once you get up to speed. It will send power to the rear to start you off, but on the road, you have to switch into the snow mode if you want a little bit of extra traction, something I definitely noticed this week. As I've come to expect from Infiniti, the front seats are very well designed. There's a reasonable amount of bolstering to help keep you in the seat, and the seat cushioning is very comfortable, especially on longer drives. But I do have to drop this to 9 out of 10 points because I think they could have done a better job with the front seat massage functionality. It's available only in the top-end trim. It does last a little bit longer than some, but it's not as aggressive as the massage functionality that you'll find in the Volvo or even the new MDX as well. We do, however, have 4-way adjustable lumbar support that is relatively aggressive, a powered tilt telescopic steering column, something that we don't find available in the Volvo, and 2-position memory over there on the driver's door. In this top-end trim, the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, including the massage functionality, but neither seat has an extending thigh cushion. If you're a shorter driver than I am, that might be a problem, but I found these seats to be just about the right length for my height at 6 feet tall. Jumping into the second row, I have a generous amount of legroom with that front seat comfortably adjusted for me, but headroom is a little bit more limited than I would like. With my head back here on the headrest and the seat in an upright position, my hair is brushing the ceiling. Keep that in mind if you routinely have taller people in your vehicle. Scooting to the middle seat position, you'll notice there is a middle seat position, and this is something that's unusual as far as luxury 3-row vehicles go. A lot of top-end trims especially seem to delete the middle seat and go for captain's chairs, which I don't find particularly useful. They're really not more comfortable than a bench seat like this would be. They don't have an armrest that's as wide as we have here, and then of course, they just don't have a place to put an extra person, which is pretty darn handy. This vehicle not only has this center seat position, it also has 5 lower latch anchors for the seats here in the second row. That allows you to put a child seat latch anchored into this middle seat position, admittedly skewed to one side rather than right there in the center, but that's a pretty handy touch. More handy than that, though, is the way the second row seats move, and this is why this is one of the most family-friendly vehicles available in this segment. You can leave a child seat or a booster seat latch anchored into position in any of these seat positions and tilt and slide the seats forward for easy access to the third row because of the way these seats move. You'll notice that as I'm moving this seat around, the seat bottom cushion and back cushion angle does not change, and that's the key thing here. Pretty much everything else in this segment articulates in some other manner where you couldn't leave a child seat latch anchored in that manner. And if I press the button over there on that other seat, you'll notice that the other seat does it as well. So you have the choice of, do you want them on the passenger side? Do you want them in the middle? Do you want them on the driver's side? It doesn't matter because all 3 seat positions function in this same way. In addition to the powered tilt slide mechanism, which is accessible via a button there on the back of the seat, you can also tilt the seat forward for cargo loading, and then you have to pop it right back up in order to move the seat forward. Getting back here is pretty easy, just as you'd expect, but on the downside, once you're back here, you find a smaller third row than we had before. With this seat back there in position, I could just barely stuff myself in here. Now the second row seats could move a little bit further forward to give me extra legroom. I can go ahead and do that. But you'll notice on the legroom chart on the side of your screen that there's not as much combined legroom in this vehicle as something like a Palisade or a Telluride, and actually a little bit less than some of the competition in this luxury segment as well. You may have noticed that on this channel I always talk about combined legroom. In a 3-row vehicle like this, that would be front row plus second row plus third row. The reason it's important to look at that combined legroom figure rather than simply third row legroom for third row passengers is that the front row and the second row move forward and backward. So exactly how much room you have left back here is going to be determined by the exact position of the second row seats and of course the front row seats as well. There is enough room in here to put a 6-foot-tall person up front, a 6-foot-tall person in the second row, and technically a 6-foot-tall person back here, but you'll notice that headroom is pretty limited. With this seat in its most upright position, my head is definitely touching the ceiling. I do have to kind of cock it to one side, but I could probably sit back here for 30 minutes or an hour as long as it wasn't a terribly rough road. There's not a lot of thigh support. My legs are pretty high off the ground, but I don't have anybody to bump into because this third row is kind of oddly a 2-position third row only. There's no center seat back here. There's just kind of a smartphone holder there. I can lean these seats back, they recline, but that doesn't actually make it more comfortable for taller people because of the shape of this hatch and the general profile of the roofline. I actually get less headroom back there if I move the seats. Between the power hatch and third row, we find 14.5 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That is enough room for you to put a 22-inch roller bag like this right in the middle and just barely close the hatch depending on the bag type. Some of them will actually have to be rotated into this position if they're a little bit harder, like the one that I have in here. Now, the third row seats are manual folding third row. They also offer a bit of recline if you're interested in that. They are going to be a lot more comfortable in the reclined position, but it's actually going to reduce headroom because of where the hinge and the opening for the cargo area is located. A power folding third row is one of the most commonly requested features in a modern 3-row vehicle. I've always found them a bit useless, and I think Infiniti does as well because they give us an interesting twist with this third row. It is manual folding like that, or I can pull it upright manually, but if you'd rather have them motor themselves back up, there's a button over there on that side, then the third row will pop back up. But it won't fold powered. The power mechanism is always manual. I don't find that to be much of a problem because I would much rather manually operate the seats. It's quite simply faster. I could move these seats up and down with just one hand, probably about 4 or 5 times, just in the time that it would take it to power one of these seats up. Now, if you want a bit more cargo space, those seats can fold down. You get 41.6 cubic feet of storage space to the second row. You can also fold down the second row seats, of course, and get 75.4 cubic feet of storage space. All of those numbers are a little bit below the Pathfinder. But most importantly, all of those numbers are also a little bit below key competitors like the MDX and some of the European options. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top end trim, so obviously there are going to be things in here that you don't find in the base model. We have a pretty large panoramic moonroof that extends to just over the second row passengers' laps. You can see the air vents in the ceiling for the second row and third row there. We have height adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. I was kind of surprised we don't see 4-way headrests here. Let me know if I'm crazy or not, but I really like the interior design of the QX60, especially these front seats. It kind of reminds me of maybe a wrenching on a bolt or something like that. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I like the design. In the middle, we have perforated sections of leather because these seats are both heated and ventilated. As I said before, bolstering on the front seats isn't terribly aggressive, so most shoppers shouldn't have a problem finding a comfortable driving position. Moving over to the front doors, we find hard plastics lower on the door that helps improve durability around that bottle holder, for instance, and then premium materials as you move your way up the door. Nice soft touch armrest there, soft touch middle section, lots of stitching going on there to help dress things up, that Bose premium speaker grille right there, and then moving up from there, we find open pore wood trim, seat memory settings for the passenger seat, and then some more stitched goods on top. The dashboard itself is a combination of different materials as well. The upper section of the dashboard is a injection molded component that's then been after stitched. You can see that stitching end there that helps dress it up. But the midsection of the dashboard, these are actually separate pieces of material all stitched together to help give this a more premium look. The air vents have a very linear theme running right there across the dashboard, but the vent itself stops here. So this is not an Audi 5000 style thing where there's lots of air vent going on there in the middle. Moving back over to the middle of the dashboard, we have this large touchscreen infotainment system, but as you can see, Apple CarPlay or Android Auto is only supported on this one side of the display. The software itself is basically common with the Nissan lineup. You can see that there is a factory mapping interface there. It also does not use that entire screen. But unlike the Apple CarPlay interface, you can choose whether you want to use the entire screen for that particular function. Most of the functions of the system, however, will not use the entire width of the screen. This side is mainly reserved for some of the extra widgets that are configurable. The screen is a touchscreen display, but you can also use the rotary command controller here in the center console to control it as well. Controlling the rear climate control zone from here is pretty easy, and you can also lock it out if you need to. Below that display, we find two USB inputs for the infotainment system, a Qi wireless charging mat. That's what the new Infiniti key looks like. On this side, we have a joystick style shifter, unlock button over there, engine start stop button, drive mode toggle right there, a button to disable the auto start stop system, auto brake hold, parking brake, and then that controller for the infotainment system. Some direct access buttons up top, and then you can use the rotary controller here to interact with the software. I love the fact that Infiniti gives you the option of using this or the screen, but honestly, the screen is easier to use. Two big cup holders right there, and a softly padded stitched armrest cover that reveals a sort of moderately sized storage cubby here. I was not able to fit some of the larger items that you will fit in the competition inside. Speaking of cubbies, we have a bin-style glove compartment over here on the passenger side. I was barely able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside, but unlike some of the competition, this glove box is also softly padded, as is the entire area around the driver and passenger's knees. That definitely makes this feel a bit more premium as you're driving the vehicle. That goes over here on the driver's side as well. And then under that center console, there is a small storage cubby where I suppose you could put very small purses. On the driver's side, we find a color heads-up display just above the full LCD instrument cluster. The instrument cluster's software is pretty similar to what we see in some Nissan products. There are two basic layouts here, one with large dials and one with those small dials moved over to the side. You can then toggle through various different readouts here, things like the turn-by-turn navigation direction, status of the active safety systems, trip computer readouts, etc. Moving out from there, we find a 3-spoke Infiniti steering wheel with paddle shifters on the back, volume up, down, and infotainment controls over here on this side, along with controls for that multifunction LCD cluster. And then on this side, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system, a button to turn on and off some of the active safety systems, voice command, and then phone button as well. Likely the first thing you're going to notice out on the road is the much more traditional 9-speed automatic transmission feel. This has a pretty aggressive first gear, so launches are pretty good, and 0 to 60 times are a definite improvement over the outgoing model. We clocked 7 seconds 0 to 60 in this vehicle, which actually puts this a little bit ahead of some of the base versions of the competition. The XC90, for instance, in its base B5 version, will take a bit longer to scoot to 60, but the Acura MDX is going to be a little bit quicker. While we're talking about acceleration, the other thing you're going to notice in the QX60 is the tuning of the all-wheel drive system. It is very conservative as far as biasing power just to the front axle. Unless I'm in the snow mode, it really is a front-wheel drive-based vehicle at higher speeds. So at, say, 40 or 50 miles an hour, if you floor it, you will feel the steering wheel tugging around because there's really no power at all going to the rear axle, according to the display, and of course, according to just the feel of the steering as well. The way to solve that is you could put it in sport, and then it's going to send a little bit more power to the rear. If I go back and take a look at this display and floor it, maybe about 20% of the power at 40 miles an hour goes to the rear. Or I could put it in the snow mode, and in this mode, then it's going to be about 50-50 front and rear, even at the higher speeds. Unfortunately, snow mode really dumbs down the throttle response. It doesn't really feel that great, so I wouldn't keep it in snow mode longer. But on some of the muddier roads that I've had to deal with this week, it has really been a godsend to have that snow mode. I am surprised there's no off-road mode at all. That's something that I wish Infiniti would have included. Regular throttle response with more aggressive all-wheel drive tuning really would have been a great thing in the wintry weather that we've had around here. That road up there was a mudslide coming down the road. We still had to get to work one day, so No flowing mud or anything like that, but there was a solid 4 or 5 inches of mud on the road, and the all-wheel drive system in this just didn't feel as sure-footed as the average all-wheel drive system in this segment. When it comes to the stopping distance, I was also a little bit disappointed, but that's a little easier to fix yourself because I think it just has to do with the tires. Bearing in mind that the road surface was damp when we did our 60-0 stopping run, 132 feet is what I measured in this vehicle. That's certainly long for the segment. I suspect it would have been maybe 125 feet in the dry, but that would be easy to fix yourself by simply swapping out different tires. Infiniti chose to put some hand-cooked tires on this vehicle that aren't the most aggressive tire available in the luxury segment, although they are relatively quiet, but the good thing is that they're fairly wide. I suspect that when equipped with better tires, the handling score here could improve from a B to a B+ relatively easily. Keep in mind that in this 3-row segment, we do have options like the BMW X5 and the Mercedes-Benz GLE. They're a lot more expensive, but they are going to have a more solid focus on handling ability. Now, the MDX does fairly well thanks to its torque vectoring axle, something that we don't find in the back of the QX60. Out on a rougher road surface, like the one that I'm on here, that has become significantly rougher lately with all of the rain and the water diversion channels, etc., the ride quality is excellent. And Infiniti gives us an excellent ride quality without having an expensive adaptive suspension system or an air suspension system or anything along those lines. That means this is likely going to be a lot less expensive to maintain in the long run. This model has the 20-inch wheels and tires on it, and it still rides better than the average competition's base model. The QX60 is certainly tuned towards the softer side of things, but I think that Infiniti has done a really good job not making it feel boaty-floaty like you might expect out of, say, something like a Buick Enclave. Although it's worth noting that the current generation Enclave isn't exactly as floaty as it has been in the past. If you're looking for something with next-level comfort, something that will be able to handle big potholes, speed bumps, freeway expansion joints, etc., then you're going to want to take a look at something with an air suspension, but avoid most of the European competition because even with the adaptive air suspensions, something like the XC90 is going to be firmer than this. Back out on the paved road, or I guess you could call this a paved road since it is covered in mud in a former landslide, I measured 70.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quieter options in its immediate competitive set. This is a little bit quieter than the Volvo XC90. That particular model has actually struggled with cabin noise, especially road noise, and this excels over that. So if you're worried about road noise, definitely give this a look. Also, I think this beats out the current generation Acura MDX depending on the configuration of the MDX. Now, some of that is likely to change if you were to swap out the tire size as I recommended earlier. Keep that in mind. Sometimes grippier tires can be louder tires, so that's something that you should really consider before you do that. Also consider the impact on fuel economy. I've been averaging 20 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. Now, admittedly, my driving here has probably skewed that fuel economy down a little bit, so I'll be generous and give this maybe a bump of 1 to 1.5 miles per gallon. That puts this right around the EPA score, but you are going to find much more efficient options in this segment. The current generation Lexus RX, of course, has not just one, but 2 different hybrid systems available and a plug-in hybrid system available as well. They're not going to be as nice sounding as this V6, but they are going to give you better fuel economy. And although we don't see a 3-row Lexus RX in this generation, we all know that there is an upcoming larger 3-row Lexus soon, and I suspect it's going to get those same hybrid systems. So if you want more fuel economy and greater reliability, make sure and stay tuned for that. Before we move to pricing, let's go through the pros and cons for the QX60. Clearly, as I've been saying all along, this is the pick for families with young kids, especially young kids in child seats that can stay in place when you need to access the 3rd row. Now, if you never use the 3rd row, I would venture that you're probably not buying a 3-row crossover in the first place. If you're buying one as a backup plan, I suppose you could handle it on the off chance you end up needing it in the MDX or something along those lines. But if you have 2 kids in child seats especially, keep this in mind. It's going to be a lot easier to get back there in the way back. We also have 7 seats in all trims, which is not something that we find in a large number of the competition, whether we're talking about some of the mainstream options with the top-end packages and options, or some of the luxury options, for instance, the Volvo XC90. It does seem that the 6-seat version is by far the most common version out there, although technically you can get 7 seats even in some of the top-end trims. I also think the interior is very comfortable and very attractive in the QX60. I really, really like the design, and value pricing is certainly there. Now, whether or not value pricing is actually an asset for a luxury car, That's kind of a different question. I do think the infotainment software needs a bit of a refresh. The design of some features in the system, like the factory navigation or the fact that Apple CarPlay doesn't use the entire screen, just feel a little bit behind the times compared to some of the competition. But the software is a lot easier to use than what we see in the Acura MDX. Now, speaking of the MDX, the QX60 is not as dynamic as the MDX all-wheel drive. Now, front-wheel drive model to front-wheel drive model, they're pretty similar. And keep in mind that at this point in time, in a lot of the US, the front-wheel drive models are still more popular. So comparing like to like, keep that in mind. Same thing goes for the Cadillac XT6 and the front-wheel drive other competitors that you might find in the segment, like a Lexus RX or the upcoming 3-row Lexus crossover. We don't know anything about the Lexus 3-row, but be sure and stay tuned because the Grand Highlander is being announced soon, and we will get you details about that just as soon as possible. You can be sure that there is a Lexus version coming really soon thereafter. Now, while we're talking about driving dynamics and the all-wheel drive system, keep in mind that this all-wheel drive system is a bit of a bummer. It really favors front-wheel drive. And I know some folks out there that have tried their QX60 on the sand, and as a result of their experience, I would not try that. The traction control system intervenes really early, really often. It can't be easily disabled, and it can't be disabled to the point where it would improve sand traction. There's just no mode for that with this all-wheel drive system. And as a result, you may find yourself getting stuck in some situations that you wouldn't in an alternative, like, I don't know, anything else in this segment, really. I think that Nissan and Infiniti could really address that with a software update. Hopefully they will do that at some point soon. Then there's the interior that has shrunk a little bit in this generation. I wasn't expecting that, but it is a little tighter. Also, there's the question of what exactly is the future of Nissan Plus? This is more of maybe a metaphysical question, I guess you could say. Is a luxury car if it's not expensive and exclusive? Is affordable luxury really a thing? I would argue that I like the way that the QX60 looks more than the Pathfinder, and I would be willing to pay a little extra for the look, for the better design on the inside, the better quality materials, the extra features and functions that you get. And I think that Infiniti has done a really good job pricing-wise with the QX60. Now, you'll notice on this chart that I don't really have any negatives to say about the QX60. I don't actually think there's really anything wrong with the vehicle. But the question, I guess, for some folks out there is there enough right to convince you to get this over some of the competition? And that brings us along to pricing, because for some folks this is going to be enough, but you'll notice that the pricing is not too far removed from some of the competitors that I might buy over the QX60, keeping that child seat situation in mind. The QX60 starts just under $50,000, $49,200 plus destination, goes on up to $66,195. That's about the same pricing range as an Acura MDX if you exclude the Type S. It will go up to $73,800, but that's for the 300 some odd horsepower single turbo 3-liter V6. Now, any way you slice it, both of these vehicles are a discount over any of the European alternatives. The best selling of those European alternatives is the XC90 from Volvo. It's a lot more, $57,095. But it is more fuel efficient, 25 miles per gallon. The mild hybrid system is standard, as is all-wheel drive. And I do think that the interior comes across as more exclusive, more premium, more comfortable, etc. And of course, Volvo has their strong safety reputation to go with it. Also, the third row is honestly a little bit more usable in the XC90, which I hadn't expected when I first drove the QX60. I had expected that since it had generally been a larger vehicle than the Volvo, that it would remain more accommodating inside. But the styling and the way that they've moved things around, especially back there in the cargo area in third row, means it is a little bit tighter. Now, the wild card in here would actually be something, I think, like the Palisade Calligraphy. It's that top-end model at $51,500. We get an 8-speed automatic transmission, pretty similar to the 9-speed, but a little bit smoother than the one in the QX60. The engine has a little bit less power, but not too much less. But the interior is absolutely enormous. The Palisade has gobs and gobs of legroom, about 117 inches. So nearly 8 or 9 inches more legroom than we find in the QX60 with more third-row headroom. I do like the design of the Telluride a bit more than the Palisade, but there is no corresponding pinnacle version of the Telluride at this time. And if you want features like the big touchscreen infotainment system, the big LCD instrument cluster, heated third-row seats, things like that, you will find those features in the Palisade. And some of them you won't find even in an MDX or an XC90 or a QX60. To be honest, the Palisade is a bit of an odd duck. There are clearly going to be portions of the interior that are not quite as premium as the Infiniti, but it is very, very limited and mainly has to do with things like the fact that you can't get real wood trim in it. But you will find features like the heated third row seats, a bigger cargo area, and a few other things that you simply won't find in the Acura or the Volvo or the Infiniti. If my money were on the line, bearing in mind that I don't have kids in child seats, I would probably end up with the Palisade. The calligraphy model is just a really good deal. Reliability has been pretty decent in the Palisade as well. Exactly where the QX60 will stack up, we don't know because it has lost that controversial CVT, but I would expect that it's probably going to be average or a little bit above average for the luxury segment, perhaps a little bit below the MDX and a little bit below the Lexus RX as well. But logically probably less expensive to keep around than any of the European options. But the Palisade is probably going to be even less expensive. It has a long powertrain warranty, a decent bumper-to-bumper warranty, but it's not going to be a luxury vehicle with a luxury logo. And ultimately, this ends up being, how much is that luxury logo worth to you? Let me know what it is down there in the comment section. I don't think that's an invalid question to ask. Obviously, people buy luxury vehicles because of the logo all the time. And really, is it worth $2,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000? That's kind of a personal question, but let us know down there in the comment section. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. I'll see all of you next week.